video, we're going to look at proteolytic fermentation. Proteolytic fermentation is not the preferred form of fermentation by the gut microbiome. However, it does occur in smaller amounts in a healthy human gut. When we're looking at proteolytic fermentation, what we'll see is that we can produce some short-chain fatty acids, but we also see is a lot of production of potentially inflammatory compounds. Now, this is an important function to look at because you'll notice that in cases where proteolytic fermentation is higher than it would be in a healthy cohort, this can be for two reasons. It can be because protein is being consumed in moderation in a normal amount, but it's not being digested properly and absorbed by the human gut. So when this happens, you have larger proteins that aren't getting properly broken down, usually due to low stomach acid, and then they're not being absorbed in the intestines where they belong. So then what you'll have is either larger peptides or even just amino acids that aren't absorbed going into the large intestine to be fermented by the gut bacteria. Or alternatively, what you could have is an increased consumption or excessive consumption of protein. So this is important because for a lot of consumers, we're told, are you getting enough protein? Are you getting enough protein? You're probably not getting enough protein by a lot of marketing companies that sell protein powders, right? And so this is really important to show people how much protein do you really need and how much protein are you actually utilizing. So this can be a really useful tool for analyzing someone's diet to look at really their protein status. Now, if the proteolytic fermentation is low, this is okay because saccharolytic fermentation is also going to make up for a lot of the short chain fatty acid production. And so in a healthy gut, it's been shown that proteolytic fermentation is going to be significantly lower than saccharolytic fermentation. And this seems to be perfectly fine. Now, a lot of these compounds that can be produced through proteolytic fermentation can be beneficial in small amounts. However, if they're overproduced, this is when a lot of times they can be inflammatory. Now, if some of these are turning up really high, this again, like I said, could be due to poor digestion of protein and or excessive consumption. So this can allow you to further pinpoint what's going on with your patient's diet. This can also help you individualize your dietary recommendations that you're making for your patients. Because as we know, one size does not always fit all. So if you have patients who are following a certain dietary pattern and it just really isn't working for them, then looking at the proteolytic fermentation side could help to reveal some of those inconsistencies. Now, when we're looking at proteolytic fermentation, we can produce short-chain fatty acids, but the other compounds that we're producing are going to be amines, phenols, sulfides, ammonia, indoles, branched-chain fatty acids, and gases like methane. And so a lot of these byproducts tend to be inflammatory. Now, let's take the amines, for example. We've got polyamines that includes putrescine, spermidine, and cadaverine. Now, putrescine and spermidine originate from arginine, while cadaverine comes from lysine. Now, putrescine and spermidine have been shown to be beneficial in small amounts and inflammatory in larger amounts. But cadaverine has mostly been, we don't really know that much about cadaverine yet, but what we do know is that in higher amounts, it tends to be inflammatory. So these we are still researching. We're still trying to understand the role of some of these polyamines in the gut microbiome. But for what we know right now is that if they're produced in large amounts, they tend to be inflammatory. Next, we have phenols. So the group known as phenols includes phenol by itself and picresol. So these metabolites appear to be inflammatory in any amount that they're produced in. So phenol and picresol are going to come from phenylalanine. So phenylalanine can be fermented directly into phenol, or it can be broken down and converted into tyrosine, and then tyrosine can be fermented into picresol. So these also appear to be inflammatory, so damaging to the gut lining, and also damaging to the gut microbiome in general. Next, we have ammonia. So ammonia is actually coming from glutamate. So glutamate can be converted into glutamine, and glutamine can then be converted into ammonia. So this is one of the reasons why we don't want to overuse glutamine in our supplementation. It's important to understand how our microbiome is utilizing it first. The other issue is that with ammonia, though it can be detoxified in a couple of various ways, it can be utilized by methanogens. So ammonia can be cleared from the gut, it can be excreted in the feces, it can also be reabsorbed into the blood, which is where it can be dangerous. It needs to be held in a tightly controlled range in the blood. Otherwise, it can lead to issues like hepatic encephalopathy. It can start to damage the brain. So it's really important that ammonia is cleared and detoxified properly. So ammonia levels again can be elevated due to a higher protein diet. So if this is the case, then it is important to take a look at the diet, right? Are you getting enough protein? Are you getting too much protein? And take stock of it in that way. So like we mentioned in another video, you can look at the pathways of gut inflammation. Ammonia can be detoxified. It can be utilized by methane producers, which can help to reduce some of the inflammation caused by ammonia. However, if you're producing too much methane, this can also be a problem. This can slow down gut motility. This can essentially turn off the current that is pushing food in the right direction through the digestive tract. So this can be very damaging to the gut in the long run. Next, we have sulfides. So hydrogen sulfide is going to be the main sulfide that we're talking about and the main one that we're measuring. So these are used interchangeably as sulfate reducing bacteria or hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. They mean the same thing. So what we're looking at here is the production of hydrogen sulfide. Now, hydrogen sulfide can be detoxified in a couple of different ways, but it tends to be very inflammatory to the gut lining. So it has been associated with a lot of inflammatory bowel conditions. And then lastly, we have methane, which we touched on briefly. But methane is a gas that's produced via both saccharolytic and proteolytic fermentation. However, when it's produced in large amounts, what you'll see is an impairment of gut motility. Now, impaired gut motility is at the root of issues like SIBO, where you're having bacteria migrate from the large intestine up into the small intestine. So anything that you can do to improve gut motility is going to be really important. Now, unfortunately, there is no wonderful way to detox methane from the gut microbiome. It can be excreted through flatulence, through burping, or it can be absorbed into the blood and then just exhaled through the lungs, so just as you're breathing. So this is where methane breath tests come into play, but a negative breath test will not necessarily indicate that there isn't any methane being produced in the gut microbiome. So if you're looking at methane production versus hydrogen production, it's important to use both a breath test and a stool test to confirm those findings. So proteolytic fermentation is really important. We can produce short-chain fatty acids through it. We can produce GABA. We can produce indoles. We can produce a lot of compounds that are necessary for intestinal health. We can also produce a lot of inflammatory compounds with it. So it's definitely something that we want to balance because it can act as a double-edged sword.